the text is that the hand of God was on him is pretty much used in the biblical tradition for somebody who's gone into some kind of a trance or vision or something. And that's becomes the important basis for what becomes later Merkaba mysticism. Most everybody who follows it then thinks that what Ezekiel sees is some vision of God in a chariot. And the problem is the word chariot is never in Ezekiel. So he doesn't claim this as a chariot, even though that's what others said. He doesn't give a name to it. He just simply describes this thing with 4 living creatures made up of animal and human life. And they are coordinated in their activities as they work and go through the cosmos. So where we left off was the description of these 4 creatures with the faces in 4 directions, 3 animals and 1 human. And then he gets to the next part of it, which begins in verse 15 of chapter 1. So let's go through 15 through 21 here and see what's going on. It says, I looked at the living creatures. I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. And as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. The rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were filled with eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And when they moved, the others moved, and when they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, and the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. If you look very carefully, you can talk about the fact that it's been edited because the same thing shows up twice sometimes. So we know these texts have been edited by somebody at one point, but nevertheless, the images of wheels, which are designed in effect perpendicular to each other, so that as this thing moves on Earth, it can move any one of 4 directions without turning. And in the sky, of course, it can do the same thing. And they're alive. The wheels are animated. There's a spirit inside of them that's moving. It's difficult to do the spirit because the spirit is what the wind, in effect. Spirit moves Ezekiel up to the vision. A spirit is moving the wheels and the characters in the story, and it's also going to move Ezekiel. So while it's something that's inside the creatures, it invokes the fact that it's somehow the presence of God and everything. So all of that tends to work. The number 4 that's mentioned is very much throughout the Bible as well. It's another one of these symbols or images. It can be the 4 directions, northeast, southwest, the 4 corners of the universe are there, and often 4 as a symbol of unity and wholeness. So the image is giving us a picture of great harmony working together. And it creates this incredibly confusing picture, which others later on try to interpret, but which we're not given an interpretation of. We're simply giving the images and see what they evoke in us as they go along. So Ezekiel, in his vision, he doesn't go up to God or the throne, and he doesn't look around what else is up there. He simply is an observer. In the literature to come, you're going to see people are going to start doing things up there. But Ezekiel's just having a vision. He's in effect a passive recipient of all that this is happening to him. But he has a privileged point of view because he's seen something which clearly ordinary mortals don't see. He's given a special vision, and this will become important to him in what follows from the vision. Anything about the wheels or anything? I've always wondered how wheels perpendicular inside each other, when you're on the ground, it seems to me that only one of those wheels can work. I don't know what if it's inside something, I don't know how it hits the ground, but not my vision. In any case, the problem of trying to make rational sense out of this vision is a doomed project. It's not meant to be. And the same thing we'll find with other kinds of images. As soon as you try to translate an image, which probably is coming from the right side of the brain, and you want to make it a left brain rational, this is what the vision means, you're in deep trouble. It's like doing that with the poem. Translating the poem into prose destroys the poem. So you have to just experience, if you will, what the vision is about. And you may never know what it's about, but if you experience it, that's the best thing you can do. All right, well, the next part of the vision then starts in verse 22. Over the heads of the living creatures, there was something like a firmament, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. Under the firmament, their wings were stretched out straight and toward each other, and each of the creatures had two wings covering its body. When they moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of El Shaddai, a sound of turmoil, like a sound of an army. And when they stopped, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the dome over their heads. And when they stopped, they let down their wings. So now the vision is starting to move from the animals. It's starting to move up the scale, if you will. And in this, the vision uses the word firmament, which, if you remember back in your Genesis account, the firmament is what God builds. It's a fixed, firm thing that's put in the sky to keep the waters above from flooding the earth. When the flood takes place, it means he lets the hatches in the firmament open up and the water comes down and drowns the place. So here in the vision, you're evoking a symbol that goes back to the creation story. I think that has a purpose here in the sense that, remember, Ezekiel's in exile. He's a prisoner of war. He's in chaos in Babylon. And all of a sudden, in the vision of God that's coming up, we're reminded of God as the one who put the world in order in the first place. And therefore, what looks like a chaotic mess on the one side, there's a vision of hope in the fact that God is a God of order, and that somehow out of all this mess, order will eventually be restored. And of course, that follows the end of Ezekiel, where he has the vision of restoration that is to come. So there's an evoking in the image then of this structure of order, and that becomes important in the process. The other thing is, when the wings are beating, it beats out this huge noise like thundering waters. Remember, the universe is surrounded by water, so it's stirring up the universe. And then in the text, it refers to God by the name El Shaddai, which gets translated in English, and I should say mistranslated, as God Almighty. El Shaddai means a God who lives on high, and it's an old name that was used in Israel for God. And so here is another one of these references that takes us back to the old traditions of Israel. And the God who was back there in those days is the same God who's with us again. So there's continuity and order in the structure of things. All of that is implied in the vision, in the use of the names. And Ezekiel then shows how the wings beat and how it moves and how they create this huge noise. And yet the noise, in a sense, is an evocative of great power that God finally wields in this whole thing. So the fact that they then begin to hear something leads us to move toward the next part, which is the climax of the vision. Go on, are you all getting this? Is there something you'd like to ask or something about any? Does everybody see the vision yourself? You hope you're all looking at this vision so you can get all excited about it. Anybody? Anything? Okay. No. Well, let's finish. The climax of the vision then now comes. This is the goal toward which we're headed. And above the firmament and above their heads was something like a throne. So the throne is mentioned, but not the chariot. It's an appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was something that seemed like a human form. So what he's seen has the form of a human. It's like that, but not exactly. Upward from what appeared like the loins, I saw something like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around, and downward from what looked like the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was a splendor all around, like the bow or cloud on a rainy day. Such was the appearance of the splendor all around. There was the appearance of likeness of the glory, the kavod. That's the important word in this too. The glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell on my face and I heard the voice of someone speaking. We are going to go on with looking at Ezekiel, but what comes next is he's commissioned to be a prophet. He swallows the scroll, which means he swallows God's words, and it will lead him to go out and become a prophet and deliver the rest of his message. What this vision is then is a vision of fire, and this evokes Moses in the burning bush. But more than that, he keeps using this word kavod, glory, that is manifested in it. The glory of God is sort of, you can't see God, remember. God is beyond what we can see, and if you see him, you die. So what you see is the eminence flowing out of God. That's his glory. It's this divine effluence coming out of God. And that becomes important. Since our direction is ultimately to get to Paul, let me read something from Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And all of us with unveiled faces see the glory of the Lord as through a reflected in a mirror. And we are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory into another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. All that language is in Ezekiel, really. And Paul is saying that he sees himself, and I assume those who are followers of his, seeing the glory of God, and it's entered into them and transforming them. That's very much what Paul's up to. And when we get to Paul, we'll talk more about that. But you can already see the language of the mystical tradition is going to be very much important in the Pauline work. So the vision is the vision of fire. And the firmament becomes a platform on which the throne sits. And under it, the creature, the four creatures, living creatures with wings, make it move. So God is movable. And what's going on here, of course, is Ezekiel sees God in Babylon. He's not at the temple in Jerusalem. And he sees that God can move. This is in some sense a contradiction to the book of Deuteronomy, which came into existence probably when Ezekiel was a boy. Deuteronomy was a reform movement that brought all of the worship centers and eliminated them in order to centralize everything in the temple in Jerusalem and make that the sole and exclusive house for God. Well, now Ezekiel's seeing God can be somewhere else besides the temple. And that shakes up the tradition a little bit because that's not supposed to be happening. And what we're going to see in the visionary literature is there's always an element of iconoclasm in it. It doesn't quite fit the tradition. And it always makes people who want to support the tradition a little suspicious of it. If you move down to the material in Nag Hammadi that we looked at one point, remember Nag Hammadi literature becomes heretical. It's something that is just too far out for those who are maintaining the old traditions in a sense. So we have to watch visionary material, but think of it this way. If you say, well, I am reading this in the Torah, this is what it says. And the next person says to you, yeah, well, I talked to God and saw him directly. Who wins that argument? Well, that's the problem. It's difficult to control visionary type people. And so they're always a little suspicious. And of course, this suspicion comes about when you get later on in the rabbinic tradition. They don't want this vision of Ezekiel being read as scripture because they see it as dangerous. It's something that people shouldn't be involved with. And so they try to cut it out. The problem was the mystical side became so popular that they couldn't eliminate it. And eventually, this passage in Ezekiel becomes the reading of scripture on the first day of Shavuot, the festival of weeks, which we call Pentecost. So it finally gets put in on a holy day. And that's because the mystic traditions was too popular to ignore. So the rabbinic tradition, which was based on the written text of the Torah, was in some sense struggling with this visionary material that seemed to go beyond it. And that's going to be true for almost all of this visionary material. It's not going to quite fit what the dominant group thinks is correct. And so they're going to try to figure out a way to eliminate it or to play it down. The other thing I think we should say, the fact that God can move on earth or in the sky or whatever is moving around on this platform starts the process that will culminate in 2nd Isaiah, where 2nd Isaiah will finally say, well, there is only one God for all the nations and all the universe. Ezekiel doesn't quite get there, but God can move around, so he's not located in space. Let me talk a little bit about the two types of religious groups or structures that are working. When you locate God in the temple, that is, religion becomes located. It becomes the center of the state or the empire, whatever it is. It usually is in league with the king or the emperor, whoever there. So you locate it, it becomes structuralized, and it becomes the focal point or center for a particular culture. You can think of the Vatican at Rome being the heart of the culture for Rome. So you have many of the religions that became empire all had structures, temples, in which God was located there, and that gave them their authority and their power. In the New Testament, it's written, much of it's written after the temple is destroyed by the Romans. And particularly when you get into John, those who worship God worship him in spirit and truth. Pretty soon you begin to say, if God is movable and can be anywhere, then he can't be located anywhere. God is not located. And the word utopia means in no place. God's in no particular place. He can be everywhere. And when you do that, then you start having a whole different assumption about what kind of religious life you build. It's not focused on a particular spatial place. All space becomes opened up to it. And that changes things. The mystical tradition tends to be moving in the direction of opening God up to be anywhere. And often they are in conflict with the religious structures that want to center God in a particular place. That's the struggle that's going on in this particular type literature. Steve, speak up.
You know, I was thinking about these visions. I was reading, I think it was in the Schweitzer thing, they're talking about the mystical tradition being something that occurs on the interface between what we see as reality and what we look on as spirit or something outside of reality. And the vision is kind of a bridge or something in between.
Yeah, it's an alternate form of consciousness of some
Exactly. So this is something that whatever it produces is not going to produce something like, here's the temple God lives in. It's going to produce some kind of an emotion or something that's outside of that reality when you do it, which will, of course, be a threat to people who want to hold on to that kind of reality. And so here you look at this vision of power. This is a vision on wheels with wings. I mean, this is really quite a vision that he has. And it's just something completely out of the ordinary. But in a way, in this position, when they're all the way in Babylon, they may feel like they're disjointed, they're cut off. Where is God? What's going on with all of this? This is something that can snap them out of that, as well as, to a degree, the old tradition. So it provides hope while it is disrupting the status quo.
Well, okay. Any other comments anybody wants? Yeah, go ahead. You gotta, August, you gotta unmute yourself. Like we can't hear you.
Okay. If God can be anywhere, then does that mean everywhere? Do you connect anywhere to everywhere then?
Yeah, I'm gonna go into that in a little minute, in a couple of minutes. Yeah, August.
Yeah, I have a question back on the verse at the end of, let's see, it was still 28. That was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord.
Yeah.
Is there any significance that it's so indirect? In other words, it didn't just say this was the glory of the Lord, it's the appearance of the likeness of.
Yeah,
very
in all of these, and if you listen to Paul's statement, it's in a mirror, it's indirect. So the notion that you can look directly on anything that comes from God, you can't. You have to, it has to be diffused in some way, because it would be too awe-inspiring and dangerous for humans to look directly into it. So it's always going to be the appearance of this. And that language is pretty much standard. Okay. Now you'll get to a few other texts are going to see things straightforwardly, and you wonder how they survived given the tradition. So others will see more than this, but nevertheless, the idea in Ezekiel, which is pretty much clear in the tradition, you can't look directly on the divine. You can't do it because it's too awesome and dangerous for humans, and they can't survive that vision. So God provides a likeness of it so that they can at least experience God's reality. Okay. Any other comments or anything anybody thinks of? Okay, what I want to do now, Roger, were you going to say something? You got to unmute.
Well, there we go. Yeah, I don't want to slow you down, but you're explaining this portability of God theme. Seems to me to be a direct precursor then to the early Celtic tradition, which is that God is everywhere and God is in everything.
Yeah, we're going to talk about, I won't be talking about the Celtic so much, but I will be talking about process thought, which says this too. But yeah, it goes back to the term panentheism. God is in everything that is. Mm-hmm. And that's in Celtic thought too, as far as I know.
Well, thank you.
Okay, what I want to do with this material now is to try to say, let's put it into the 21st century and see what to do with it. For me personally, and I'm using what makes sense to me, you have to, for those of you, you may find your own one. There are two ways in which I try to work with this material for myself. One is to use depth psychology, particularly coming out of discussions from Jung and Jung's followers. That's one thing. And the second one is in process thought, which is developed by Whitehead and Cobb and Griffin and others. So I want to go to those two ways of understanding things and try to make sense out of what Ezekiel is doing. The first thing that strikes me when I look at this vision is it reminds me of my own dreams. That is, the language is mysterious, it's confusing, it doesn't make any sense, I don't know what to do with it. It just, all kinds of images show up. It sounds like a lot of kind of things that come out of my dreams. And this is an indication that, from my point of view, the vision is coming out of the deeper side of Ezekiel for a lot of different reasons. And the images that come out they're not rational. They don't make logical sense. They're trying to evoke things, and they often combine different kinds of things like animals and humans and all that, or abstract images or mythological beasts, all of which in some way or other are evoking something in us, even though we may not know what they are. And to get into some of those images, you may need help. That is, you may need people who know more about images and how they work, or something more about the depth psychology that you're in order to get there. Or you may do what a lot of people do with these things. They don't try to interpret them. If some big dream comes out, let it become an image that you meditate on. Give it life by seeing it, working with it, allowing it to come, drawing it as a picture, writing a poem about it, describe it, tell it to a friend. So rather than interpreting it, just give it some life. And it's interesting how I've experienced in myself, when I do that with dreams, they begin to communicate more to me. More things begin to happen, and I get more insight into what's going on. So Ezekiel's vision evokes all sorts of things from his culture. We looked at it: temple images, ark images, constellation images, those statues that are on the gates of some of the places, which are combined animals and human forms and so forth. You take the stuff from your culture, it weaves it together into some kind of vision, and the vision is trying to communicate something. The idea is this stuff is coming up for a reason. And so what we do with it matters. Ignoring it isn't going to help us much. That's part of the problem. What I also have experienced myself, and what is described in the literature about it, is that often images that come up are compensatory to where you are. Let's go back to Ezekiel for a minute. Ezekiel's the prisoner of war. We get no idea of what he's thinking. We don't even get much biographical information about him. So I'm here guessing and speculating about him. But I assume, as a prisoner of war and as a person put in exile, his life is in somewhat chaotic. He's a priest without a sanctuary, no temple. He's in a different land, cut off from people. People have been killed and destroyed that he knows. So I'm assuming he's in a place of chaoticness, of disorder, where life doesn't make anything. And if he stays there, it's going to be very difficult. The vision compensates for that by giving him a vision of order and mystery and God's power and God's order. It challenges him to see something differently than the experience that he's caught up in. This happens in dream experiences as well, by the way. For example, if you have a fairly negative image of yourself or what's going on, your dreams will often make you look good. It compensates, if you will, for your vision. On the other hand, if you think too highly of yourself, a dream's probably going to give you images to knock you down a bit. So the dreams can be compensatory. Sometimes they simply state where you are, but a lot of times they're trying to create more balance in your life and move you forward. off of where you are. And that certainly does happen in Ezekiel. The dream experience moves him out of the prisoner of war mentality and makes him a prophet and becomes the spokesman for Yahweh to the people. It gives him great authority and identity, which he didn't have if he was simply going to be stuck in exile and the experience of exile. In the prophet before him, Jeremiah, who he's influenced by, Jeremiah says at one point, "Who can stand in the counsel of the Lord, that we should hear or see his word? Who has given heed to his word? Who could listen to God and see him?" Well, Ezekiel can put up his hand. I have. That's not what the tradition expects to happen. So out of this vision, then there's a new sense of order for Ezekiel and values. If the chaos of exile took away many of the values that he accepted and believed as part of his tradition, these new values in the vision come back in, giving him a sense of hope and purpose, which otherwise he wouldn't have had. All this happens with people who, in dreams, it happens in cultures. Cultures often become chaotic. I remember back in the 60s, which I loved a lot. I mean, the demonstrations, the hippie movements, the whole thing. There was a whole movement of culture in that direction of the left. And what happened was you rebounded in the culture and got Nixon. So you got a conservative group coming back. Cultures tend to balance out too. You can't go in one direction too far without a correction taking place. And there are usually images or people or something that comes up to rebalance the structure of the society. And individuals, the same thing happens. Things happen that bring things back together again. There's one other thing that I've experienced in my own working with dreams that I think is important in this regard as well. At one point in my life, I was having a recurring dream, which was so frightening, I did everything I could to avoid it. It kept coming back at me, though, at the point where I couldn't avoid it any longer, and I got some help working with it. And finally, I was able to face it and go through the agony of what it was at. And then once I got through it and accepted it and integrated it into myself, a sense of peace came about. It was a sense of healing that took place. And that happened in the integration of it. And I think the fact that I experienced the healing in this kind of visionary material was important. And I think Ezekiel must have had something like that bringing him together before he became the prophet. And for me, the fact that some kind of healing and inner peace takes place raised a different question for me. And that was, is this simply something that's part of my psychological makeup? Or is there something more than that at stake? Is there something else going on here? And that was where I raised the question of God. Ezekiel believes God is providing him that vision. I want to take that idea seriously, except I don't share his view of God. I don't see God as all-powerful, sitting up in heaven, controlling all events, condemning people, and so forth and so on. But and much of the traditional Western view of God, that God is up there, looking down, is uninfluenced by what happens. God can't experience the world, can't suffer, can't change. God is in a state of perfection, has all power and all knowledge, all those kind of things. That's not what my experience was about. I was experiencing something that was very much working with me, helping me, adding to my life. And so I began to go back to what I first ran into when I was in seminary and grad school, and that was process thought. And now the more I worked on it, the more that became important to me. So I know some of you have been in class when we've dealt with process thought, but let me at least say some things about it that I think work here. For process thought, God is part of all experiences in the universe. God somehow in there. Each new experience that takes place, God is trying in some way to influence it. Let's say God is trying to make us more creative, more holistic in our understanding of things, trying to urge us to move in a direction. Think of Ezekiel. He's stuck in exile. If he can't move forward, he's going to be in despair. Part of the vision is to move him forward into a new direction. And I think that's in process that's what God is trying to do. He's trying to move us forward. He can't coerce us. I think Ezekiel's God is coercive. It can coerce you to make you do something. But in process thought, Whitehead gets it from Plato. Plato said, God's power is persuasive, not coercive. And in the Christian tradition, of course, we argue that God's power is love. And again, love is not coercive, it's persuasive. So what we have as I was trying to find out, process thought was arguing, here is a God who is a part of my experience. God is seeking to communicate to me, to help me move my life forward. Well, why can't God work through dreams or fantasies or images or poetic or art or music or whatever? If God's a part of all experience trying to move things forward out of the past, then there are multiple ways in which God can influence us from moment to moment. All that began to make sense to me out of what I had experienced. And so the notion of God as a process God that is seeking to heal me, bring me a sense of order and move me forward, also matched psychologically what I found the depth psychologist saying was happening to me. So suddenly I found a theological system and a psychological system that made sense for me in the 20th and 21st century. And I began to see that Ezekiel's visions are very much something that describe things that we experience, but we experience them in a different culture. We may have different ideas, different values, and so forth. But nevertheless, the human experience of what's happening is very similar to what I understand to be happening to Ezekiel. And so I can translate it from one culture to another. And of course, it changes it when you do that. But what becomes normative in this is, what are you experiencing? What's happening to you? And how does what you see, vision, dream, or whatever, how does that affect the life that you have? That's where I think we can keep going into Scripture and finding how Scripture opens us up to these kinds of experiences, which in effect can help us not only relate to people in the ancient world, but can see how the experiences they're struggling with the ancient world can be of value to the world in which we live. What do you, any reactions for many of you about any of this? What you see? Well, if you're going to be that quiet, we're going to take an offering.
So I'll make a comment, Jim. So the theme for this coming Sunday for the worship service is unlearning. And Julie Hurt was remarking about this yesterday in staff meeting, how important unlearning is. She had a wonderful quote that went out to you all yesterday. But it sounds, Jim, not only have you done a great deal of unlearning, but I think you're really inspiring us to think and look at these texts in ways that help us unlearn so much that we have received about the tradition, about God, and this way of, well, the scriptures are really they express their understanding of God in cultural norms appropriate for them to the day. The tragic thing is we're at least 20 centuries away from that, and we really haven't unlearned all of that to encounter God in a new way. And I hear you doing that.
Yeah, I do feel that. I think what I was trained to think, and what I grew up thinking, was the cultural issues that are in the vision were literally true and normative forever. And so that my job was to memorize that and see it as literal truth and not have to ask anything else about it. Well, that doesn't work too well. What I realize is many of these experiences are culturally conditioned. They should be. There's no way we can avoid not being in some culture. But what we need to look is what is being expressed in that particular culture and how that human expression may in fact open us up to insights that we haven't had. And that's the difference. I had to unlearn both my fundamentalist understanding of scripture and frankly, my academic study, which read all the scriptures as left brain rational things to make sense out of, rather than encountering and experiencing them. Steve, you want to say something?
Yeah, your point about thinking about this, recasting it in another way, trying to look into it a little more deeply. I was thinking about that in terms of the other thing that you were saying is, why can't God work in ways we don't know, through visions or dreams or whatever? With learning theory, and something we've all experienced, sometimes we're grappling with the problem, we sleep on it or whatever. We wake up the next morning, it's all worked out.
Yeah.
With that. And so part of it is, as far as the unlearning goes, is maybe looking at it another way, is just opening up to something else. Just put it aside. You could say, give it to God or whatever, and just let yourself experience something in a different way. When you do that and allowing that for God to speak with you, and these kind of things, the visions or the dreams, may be upsetting, but the process of dealing with that could really take us to a place where we would rather be, and we might be led there in ways we don't know.
Yeah. Well, in process, there's no question but what the past has an enormous effect on shaping the present moment. There's no way around that one. The problem is if the past simply gets repeated again and again and again, and we're not moving forward. What in process that God is continuing doing is encouraging us not to get stuck in the past, but to move forward, to find something of novelty, newness to put into this. And it may be an unlearning process, recognizing, well, that doesn't work anymore and that doesn't make sense, and opening ourselves up to the new possibilities of something going on. This was true in my own experience going through dream work, where particularly dreams helped me face up things I didn't want to face in my past and opened me up to the possibilities of new things, which was a struggle to get there. But nevertheless, my life changed because of it. So there's a fundamental experience here, which I think process thought can make sense out of, and which I think depth psychology makes sense out of. So those are the two that I work with in trying to make sense out of all this stuff. I'm going to give you some homework. So for next time, see what you can do with this stuff. Ezekiel, of course, was in the midst of chaos. Guess what, guys? We are too.
I'll say.
Whether it be the pandemic or the crazy political world that we're living in, or whatever it may be, we're living in it. My question is, what images come up to you when you face the fact we're in this pandemic? Are images coming up? Are they negative? Are they positive? What's being invoked in you? Give yourself a chance to see what might come up when you think about all of what's happening to you and what we're having to live with now in terms of staying home and wearing masks and all the things that we're doing. What comes up? Think about that. over the week.